The chandeliers threw soft circles on white linen. Laughter moved like warm water around the table, and my father lifted his glass, 60 candles trembling behind him like a field of tiny stars. He smiled, that careful smile he wears when the room is his. This is the son I'm proud of. His hand settled on Ethan's shoulder. Easy practiced a gesture that fit like an old jacket. The table broke into applause. Forks chimed. Someone whistled. My chair barely made a sound when I slid it back. I stood, nodded at no one, and walked quiet, steady, as if leaving was something I had learned to do the way you learn to breathe. The carpet swallowed my footsteps. The band played a standard. The door took me in and closed behind me like a secret. Out on the balcony, the city hummed. Air colder than it should have been for spring pressed against my face. I kept my palms on the rail until the metal answered with its own chill. I counted backward, 12, 11, 10. An old trick I taught myself to make time loosen its grip. Inside a toast, a laugh, a story about Ethan that I had heard a dozen ways, the details changing, like weather, the ending always the same. I breathed slow, careful. The night pressed in, and for a moment a boy of 12 stood in my skin again. When I was 12, the cake listed to one side chocolate, trying its best to hold sparklers where candles should have been because Mum couldn't find enough matches. Dad was caught at work, 3 words that sounded like a lock clicking shut. 2 months later, Ethan turned 10 and the backyard filled with helium balloons, a magician who pulled a dove from nowhere, a cotton candy cart that painted the air with sugar. I told myself ponies weren't my thing anyway, told myself clay liked me better, told myself wood didn't look away when I reached for it. There were other lessons. In 5th grade, Mr. Klein let me stay after to sand the edges of the birdhouse kit everyone else rushed through. He showed me how to feel along the grain with the back of a knuckle. I brought it home proud in a way that tasted new. Dad turned it in his hands, said neat, and set it down without looking at me. The next week, Ethan hit 2 points in his first basketball game, and we had a barbecue with neighbors I didn't know, music too loud for a school night. The grill smoked the yard, filled with praise that landed like confetti on the same shoulders every time. In middle school, I won a regional art contest, a small plaque with my name spelled right, a photo in the local paper where my smile looked cautious like it might get me in trouble. Dad folded the paper, nodded once, told me to put the plaque somewhere. It wouldn't make a mess. When Ethan was named captain of a team that had no captains, miraculously, we celebrated at a steakhouse where the waiter knew my father's drink and the manager comped dessert for the table. I learned how to clap on cue. I learned how to take up less space, how to make my happiness quiet enough that it didn't set anything off. There were summers too, a camping trip where it rained the whole time and the tent sulked water, finding us no matter how we moved. Dad left early for a call, the car taillights carving a red line between the trees. Ethan and I sat under a tarp and ate crackers that had learned to be soft. I whittled a stick into a spiral just to see if I could, and Ethan said it looked cool, and for a second the world tilted toward me, and then it tilted back. By the time I chose carpentry, I knew applause, and I weren't old friends. I loved the way wood answered when you asked gently, the way a joint-seated flush could turn a pile of boards into a table that wouldn't lie to you. I loved the dust that settled on my skin like proof I had done something honest. Dad called it a hobby, told me to keep my options open, which is a kind of dismissal dressed up as advice. Ethan went to business school, learned to talk in rooms where the air is expensive. Dad learned new stories to tell about him, and he told them often. 2 weeks after the party, we had a family meeting. The dining room smelled like lemon oil and old decisions. Dad took his chair at the head, the chair that had learned his shape. Mr. Aldridge, the family lawyer, sat to his right with a thin folder that looked delicate and mean at the same time. Ethan sat across from me, elbows off the table tie, straight eyes tired in a way that suggested he had earned it. Mom placed her hands in her lap and kept them there as if she were holding something in place you couldn't see. "The will," Mr. Aldridge said, as if we hadn't all been thinking that word, since the invitation is straightforward. The house, the company, the accounts, the language, moving cleanly from one name to another like water, running down a single groove. Ethan's groove. My line came at the end, a check, with enough zeros to mean something and too little weight to mean what it meant to me. "You'll understand," Dad said, meeting my eyes with a look he had perfected for men who didn't get the deal they thought they were getting. "You're not the man for this family's future." No anger, no volume. It landed like a small, precise knife. I watched the light move across the rim of my glass and imagined I was drawing a joint in my head, calculating the angle that would hold when the load arrived. I said nothing, which was both practice and choice. I slept badly. The attic called to me the way a place does when it has something to say you've trained yourself not to hear. I went up after midnight. Dust rose like memory in the beam of my flashlight. Boxes with labels that meant everything and nothing, toys that had survived childhood by being ignored, a trunk that had been my grandfather's brass, dull leather cracked like a map of old storms. The tin box was taped underneath the lid, a hiding place for a person who wanted to forget and remember in the same motion. Inside a hospital bracelet, the paper yellowed the ink a stubborn blue. Infant W a Polaroid. The colours worn thin, Mom in a hospital bed, hair dark and damp at her temples, a newborn in her arms and beside her. Not my father. A woman, 20-something, eyes rimmed with sleep and awe, a hand reaching toward the edge of the frame as if she could hold the future in place. On the back, a single word in Mom's careful hand, Claire. The name tasted like a key. In the morning, I brought a bag of fresh rolls to Mrs. Green, our old neighbour, because bringing something felt like permission to ask for something else. Her living room smelled like lavender and old books. She wore a cardigan with a button that didn't match, and the exact same expression she wore when we were children, and she pretended not to notice we were tracking mud. "Claire," she said when I asked, softer than a confession. "There was an accident summer of '93, Route 17. I heard she made it through the night. I heard a baby cried." She looked past me for a long moment as if the window had learned to show her the past when she needed it. "Your father was different after that," she said. Quieter, meaner maybe, like a man holding his breath underwater. Who was she to him, I asked, and I heard how the sentence refused to be a question. Mrs. Green pressed her lips together. "Sometimes a story is too heavy for one person to lift. Be careful, Adam. Some truths don't end when you find them. They begin." I started reading The House, like evidence. Mum's silences, Dad's closed door calls, the way Ethan looked away when I looked at him too long. 2 nights later, I was locking up my workshop when Dad's voice came from the driveway. Low, clipped the voice he used when the person on the other end thought they had leverage. "No more transfers," he said. "It's done when I say it's done." A pause, the sound of a breath he didn't want. "Aldridge will handle the rest." He didn't see me in the cedar's shadow. I stood still bark, pressing a relief map into my back, and let the words settle where they wanted. The county clerk's office was the colour of old paper. Files had been moved, sealed, moved again. Names went missing in ways that suggested someone had helped them leave. But old newsprint is stubborn. July 1993 two-car collision on Route 17, the ink describing physics in a tone that pretended to be bored. Victim Claire Whitaker, 22. Another clipping, a hospital donation that arrived 3 days later through a holding company I recognized as one my father used when he wanted to be present, and invisible at the same time. In a ledger drawer, a receipt for formula and diapers, cash time-stamped at a midnight that matched the one Mrs. Green kept in her head. I brought the bracelet, the photo, the clipping to Mum. Sun angled across the kitchen table, the wood carrying our lives like a patient witness. Mum kept her hands, flat fingers spread a little, as if she were steadying something you couldn't see. "It was complicated," she whispered. "I wanted you. I want you." "That part was never complicated." "Is he my father?" I asked. The words crossed a distance inside me that felt like a city you walk end to end at dawn. She closed her eyes. "He raised you. It hurt. It also fit like a joint, finely seated after you shave a sliver off a tenon, 100 times patient stubborn, until the wood agrees to become what it was meant to be." Mr. Aldridge agreed to see me informally, which is lawyer, for we will pretend we weren't here when we leave. His office smelled like leather and lemon oil and other people's secrets. He looked the way I remembered, only more, so as if time had been sharpening him for this conversation. "There are arrangements you don't need to trouble yourself with," he said, eyes not quite landing on mine. "I'm already troubled," I said, and set the bracelet on his desk. He looked at it like a man seeing the first page of a file he's read 100 times to the end. "If you go on," he said finally, "using my name like it cost him something, you won't like what you find." "I already don't," I said, and when I opened his door, a man I didn't recognize brushed my shoulder and murmured, "Stop digging for your own good," his breath coffee and mint his eyes, letting me know that some favors travel across decades if you feed them. The next day, someone had gone through my truck. Nothing missing. Everything moved, a glove on the seat that should have been in the door, a tape measure that had learned a new corner. I took a slow breath and placed every tool exactly where it belonged, as if order itself could be a kind of prayer. I waited until my hands were calm to go to Dad's study. The room had the stillness of a church that no longer believed. I placed the Polaroid on his desk and watched his eyes find it and do the math. "I asked Mum," I said. "She said you raised me." "I did," he said, his voice choosing a register that left no oxygen for argument. "You're standing here, aren't you?" Who was Claire? The clock made a click between seconds I had never heard before. "Someone I failed," he said. "We all live with our failures. You live with yours by cutting me out." His mouth pulled toward his jaw, a movement I had learned to read as pain disguised as control. "I live with mine by protecting what I can," he said. "I protected this family." I almost laughed. The sound didn't arrive. Sunday dinner wore its best suit. Napkins folded into swans, silver-tuned, to a brightness that felt like threat. I waited until the room was warm with habit. Then I stood. "This is Claire," I said, and held the Polaroid so every face could find it. This bracelet was on my wrist in '93. Route 17 a night that didn't end for anyone who was there. Dad paid to close doors that should have stayed open. Aunt Linda's fork hit porcelain a small bell of shock. She stood slowly, as if the ground needed to be negotiated. "Tell them, Richard." She said, her voice the same voice she had used to pull us out of a neighbor's pool when we were small and the rules had suddenly mattered. "Tell them how you begged Claire to go, how you pressed cash into a nurse's hand to move the paperwork off the books, how you told me it was mercy." Ethan went pale. He stared at the photograph like it contained a version of him he had been pretending not to see. "I knew," he said, not lifting his gaze. "Not everything, but enough. I didn't want to break Mom." Dad's hand trembled once, then found its anger and closed into a fist. "Get out," he said to me, his voice empty of everything but command. "Get out of my house." Mom made a sound that didn't belong to words. I left before I could learn how to carry it. Work held, work waited, The community centre project the company had promised the city was a mess wearing a hard hat. The budget was a rumour, the schedule was a lie. I took the drawings home and spread them across my table until the table disappeared. I redrew. Joints turned spans, moved loads like chess pieces. I cut fat where people had been feeding themselves. I walked into a meeting with sawdust on my sleeves and came out with signatures the project needed and egos didn't. When steel stalled, I traded lumber for time. When permits snarled, I found the person at a desk who still believed their job mattered and asked for help like a man asking for the truth. At dawn, I drove a borrowed truck to get what we needed because no one else would. On site, the smell of cut pine rose like a promise. The foreman Pedro had a laugh that made men lift straighter. He called me maestro in a way that felt like a handshake. We boxed out a gym floor that would sit long, would take the weight of 100 bodies, discovering what their legs could do. A kid from the neighborhood, Jay, hovered at the fence until I handed him a broom, and he learned how to make a clean path through a day. Ethan showed up at my workshop a week later. He paused at the door the way a person pauses at a church. He looked smaller without a conference room around him. "You saved it," he said. "You saved the project." "I saved the workers from losing paychecks," I said. "The board will call it vision." He nodded. His eyes were wet and he didn't bother to hide it. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words wobbled but didn't fall. We stood in the smell of cedar and lacquer and let silence do its work. Mom came that night with an envelope that had learned to be soft. Inside, a letter. The paper thin enough to feel like breath, the ink a brown that had once been black. His hands are warm, Claire had written in a looping, careful script. "If I cannot stay, let him be where love is." I read it twice, then pressed it flat to the table, my palm over the words, until the warmth of my hand made a ghost of itself on the page. Something inside my chest widened without asking permission. The man from the hallway found me again, only this time he left a note on the windshield of my truck. Enough, the note said. Underneath a drawing of a line and a boot. I folded the paper twice, then a third time, and fed it to the shop's small metal trash can. That night, I heard steps on the gravel behind the workshop. I stepped outside with a mallet in my hand and a calm I didn't know I owned. A shadow moved, then another. "You can talk to me," I said into the dark, "or you can keep being a rumor." Silence. A cough. Then the shape of a man close enough to count as brave. "Orders are orders," he said. "Orders change," I answered. He looked at the mallet at my hands at the open door behind me, where the light made a square on the ground like a promise. He nodded once and left. The gravel remembered him for a while after he was gone. Weeks turned, the building grew a spine, then ribs, then the skin of walls that kept weather where it belongs. We were behind, then we weren't. We were over budget, then we weren't. Pedro taught Jay how a line snaps true. If you pull the string just so, how patience is a tool like any other. Jay started showing up early, started staying late, started standing a little taller when people said his name. Then Dad's body did what bodies do when they have been carrying too much for too long. The stroke came like a gavel. The hospital smelled like bleach and endings. Machines hummed a polite chorus. His face, without his voice to give it orders, looked older and softer and more like a man than I was used to. I stood in the doorway and tried to find where anger ends and grief begins, and of course there was no line, just a shoreline the tide kept rewriting. He came to my workshop weeks later, slower, a cane measuring out the distance between who he had been and who he was now. He ran his hand along the edge of a finished table fingertips, finding the places a hand learns to find. "Good work," he said, voice rough, softer than I had ever heard it. "Good work." He didn't say I'm proud. He didn't need to, not anymore. We stood there, two men and a table, and the noise of a street doing what it does, and it felt like the room had more air in it than it used to. By winter, Mr. Aldridge called me in. Papers on his desk that had once been armoured now looked like paper. The will had changed, not a fairy tale, not a sweep of the hand that turns everything golden, but enough, a foundation in Claire's name, funded to keep the centre we were building alive when ribbon cuttings were a memory. Shares split along lines that looked less like pride and more like ground. I told him it would be messy, Aldridge said. Most things that matter are I said and signed where he pointed. On opening day, the gym floor shone like still water, the varnish holding the lights in it. Kids ran in shapes that only made sense to them, laughter lifting the roof a fraction of an inch with each pass. Pedro stood with his hands on his hips, his face a map of different suns. Jay wore a volunteer badge like a medal and taught a boy half his size how to bounce a ball without chasing it. Mum talked to donors with the calm of a person who knows something money doesn't. Ethan and I stood at the back for a while the way men do when they're learning how to be in a room without a script. Dad arrived late. The cane tapped the floor in patient syllables. He stopped at the plaque by the entrance and read the name engraved there, Claire Whitaker, and he reached out and touched the cold letters with 2 fingers, the way a person touches a headstone or a promise. He nodded once. When he reached me, he didn't make a speech. He looked at the court, at the kids, at the beams that held, and said, quiet almost to himself, "It stands." "It does," I said. We watched a girl sink a shot that made her friends yell her name. We watched a teacher stand a little taller at the sound. We watched a boy throw an arm around another boy the exact way brothers do when they are both older and younger than the story says. I thought about the night on the balcony, the sentence that used to slice me the moment it appeared. This is the son I'm proud of. The words still had teeth, but they didn't find me the way they once did. I wasn't the son he was proud of, not the way he had meant it, not the way he had taught rooms to believe. I was a man who could make a table that didn't wobble. I was a man who could keep a project from collapsing under its own ceremony. I was a man who could take a boy with a broom and put a line in his hands and watch him learn to make it snap true. I was a boy who had learned to leave rooms quietly, and a man who had learned finally to stay. There were small, ordinary afters. I found the courage to read Claire's letter to Mom aloud. My voice, careful around the words I knew, had cost someone I'd never meet everything. Mum listened with her eyes closed, palms pressed together, the ring catching light and making a small sun on the table. We cried the kind of crying that doesn't ask to be seen. Ethan started showing up at the center on Saturdays. He taught a workshop on resumes that somehow ended with 3 kids arguing about the merits of different shoe brands, as if the world depended on it, which, in a way, it does. He apologized again, different this time, an apology that had learned to be a verb. We didn't fix decades in an afternoon. We started something that knew how to last longer than a conversation. Dad and I learned a new language, not fluent, not fancy words that didn't bite. He came to the shop sometimes and sat without fidgeting, which for him counted as confession. He told me a story about his father. I had never heard a man who could only love by controlling the room. I told him about Mr. Klein and the knuckle trick for finding the grain. He tried it cautious, as if the wood might judge him.
"Feels like..." "Truth," he said, surprised, and I laughed, and he did too, and the sound landed in the shop and stayed.
I took the hospital bracelet to the center and put it in a shadow box in my office beside a photo of the floor before we finished it, the lines chalked in a blue that stained your fingers. The bracelet looked small behind glass and also exactly the size of something that had moved the world. Underneath it, I printed a sentence from the letter, "Let him be where love is," and for the first time the sentence felt less like a command and more like a map someone had drawn for us and left where we'd find it when we needed directions. Some nights I still step onto the balcony at home and let the city hum. I think about the boy I was, the rooms I learned to leave, the rooms I now know how to enter and stay in. I think about Claire, about the way a name can hold a door open forever. I think about my father, a man built from a blueprint. He didn't draw a man who mistook control for care until he didn't, until he put his hand on a table I had made and said good work and meant it. I think about the center and the kids who run until they forget to be careful about the way a ball sounds on a floor that will hold, about the way a laugh can make a building feel lighter. I think about Ethan and how we found each other in the middle distance, two men making new habits out of old bones. The chandeliers are gone now, replaced by warehouse lights and morning sun and the honest shine of a finished coat. But sometimes when I'm planing an edge or sanding to a quiet, I can hear in my teeth, I hear a toast in a far room, and I watch a man lift a glass and say words that used to unmake me. I let him talk. I let the room clap. And then I go back to the work that holds. I am not the son he was proud of. I am a man I am proud to be. And that, finally, is enough.